Hello everyone, hope you're still doing wonderful at the start of this course. Welcome to Notes 1 and 2, the introduction and plan for the course. These notes will cover a basic plan of what is the point of this course, and give you a foundation of what I believe of people talking about science, and what does it mean if we think about science as a culture, and investigating people within it. Now, this course, what is the point of all GNED 1103s? Because you'll see that there are different sections and they're run differently. And now the main point of this is for students to investigate one particular scientific or technological innovation from multiple disciplinary perspectives. But more thinking about, like, what is innovation? What is science itself? What is it as a culture? How are these combined? And what are the important aspects you have to incorporate if you are talking about both? So students will explore this innovation to understand the mathematics and science that underlie it, or have influenced by it, and will discuss the role of numeracy and technology in shaping our future. And topics will vary different from section to section of this actual course. Now, why are you here? What is the intended purpose? Other than to give you a GNED Cluster 1 Level 1 credit that everyone needs, is to illustrate how science is conducted. What is it as a culture? What are the important aspects of it? If you are going to be part of that culture, what are things that you have to understand? If you're going to critique that culture, what are things that you need to actually understand? And it's also develop your skills in the language of science, being mathematics. And that relates around it, that if you're doing science, math is going to be part of that. That's a cultural artifact and a way of speaking that's ingrained into the language. And we'll try to cover in this course to give you a feel for this. I don't expect people to be perfect at everything for math. And you'll see later on as we get into this that we'll be dealing with basic statistics and quantitative reasoning. And you're just trying to show me, what are you doing? How are you becoming part of this science culture, or knowing how to talk and understand it? And you have to understand math as part of that. Also, why are you here? It's to build upon your quantitative reasoning skills. Now note, I'll have a definition for this coming up on the next slide, and this is always good for an exam, say, I don't know, maybe the midterm, or your task 2, or task 3, and so forth, and even from the actual final. It's a key part of the actual course is that, well, what is quantitative reasoning? And we'll get deeper into this of what is even reasoning, and giving examples of this, and critiquing it, and having your own chances to come back. Now, breaking down quantitative reasoning, if we start with quantitative, like, what is that? And it's associated, it's more like anything, associated with the objective of quantifying things or phenomenon, and measurable, so, and verifiable. So such as lightness, heaviness, weight, girth, like thickness, thinness. Like, this is all stuff from here is that by being a phenomenon is that you can measure it. There is some kind of units associated with this. There are specific tools that you use to get measurements, like a ruler giving you centimeters or actual inches. And this verifiable part of it is that beyond just you, just the subjective side of you, but being that objective, being separate from you, is that if I measure this and I use this tool, and someone else is able to use those same tools following the same units, they should also be able to get the same, if not very similar, measurements out of this. So becoming separate from this. And this is the important part of the quantitative. Now, quantitative reasoning is the application of basic mathematics skills such as algebra to analyze and interpret the real-world quantitative information in a context of a discipline or interdisciplinary problem. Now, that's a longer definition, but really the point of this is that I have a problem. I want to come to some actual solution, and if I have an answer, and that's based upon my steps that I follow for my actual reasoning, is that it has to involve some form of actual mathematics. So it's not just, hey, let's solve a math equation, 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's just math right here. This is, oh, okay, I have math skills. I have like other algebra, I have analyzing it. I also have an understanding of what is the current context that the problem is actually part of. And I have a discipline that's related around it. And based upon all these different spheres of knowing and knowledge, you bring them together to actually make some kind of actual decision. Now, this beginning point, we're not leaving it here. We'll come back to this as we go through reasoning, and as we go through examples that we'll read, and as we actually apply it. Now, plan for the actual course. I try to keep this structured, and like we're going to go through different phases where we do a general overview of actual science. So we're starting with the scientific method, something that's very important. We'll do part 1, and we're going to do a high-level kind of flyover of it, like a recon mission. We're not going to delve deep into actually every single step of it too deep first. We're going to go get a general feel for everything. We see an overview of stuff, and then in future steps like scientific method part 2, and you'll see later scientific method part 3, we're going to dig down deeper into each of those steps to make sure, okay, now we've had a basic understanding. How can we go deeper and go to the next level? And we can level up our knowledge, level up our turns, and understanding this more. Now, in between these, we'll be taking some steps, like from scientific method 1, we'll take a step back and have talk about reasoning and the scientific method, and what is reasoning, and that's something that's built in throughout the entire method. Once we get through stats, we also need to take steps into statistical reasoning and science. That'll be our math, quantitative reasoning part, and going through deeper into the scientific method. And the whole part of that is that some of it may be a review from stuff that you've done in the past or your own background, but it's to build one constant way in the actual class of how are we talking about science as a culture? What out of that is important? How do we innovate if we're in science? Now, our topic specific for the course will end up being virtual reality, so VR, and augmented reality, AR. And thinking about innovation. Now, this will not come until much later in the course. You're not expected to know a ton about this. It's just an area field that I know is very accessible to multiple areas of study. And it is something that is impacting our lives now. And what I want for us, and we'll talk about this in a bit in our course, is like, well, if you were to try innovating with VR, AR, how would you go about doing that? And how would you go about doing it if you're coming from a science background? Like, how do I think of questions then for innovating? How do then I evaluate that actual knowledge and the steps I go through? And no one here has to be perfect with this. We'll go through examples, and it's just a way to try to apply and look at, well, what have we learned about the scientific method and science and innovation, and how maybe we can come to new questions and answer them in different ways. Now, what is science? That is a huge question, and science is different to different people. Some have very strict views on it, some positive, some negative, but like we have to start somewhere. Now, throughout this entire course, I would like you to think of science as a culture on its own that has its own customs and ways of communicating. That if you are going into science courses, you are interacting with people that are heavily involved in science or parts of our world that have been impacted by science, you have to think of like, well, there's specific ways that people talk. There's specific customs that you have within actual science, and you need to understand those if you're being part of that, or you're critiquing or understanding where are people coming from. Someone who comes with a very strong scientific background and the way they think and reason and interact within the world is impacted by these customs and cultures. And we need to start viewing it that way and put our stepping into it. Now, giving a quick basic definition, it can also be thought of as the attempt to uncover the laws of nature according to a set principles and a critical way of thinking called the scientific method. Now, right here, now you have to realize if this is a culture, there's sometimes terms when people read definitions to you, things don't pop out to you as quickly. But when you're part of that culture, they'll be like, oh, no, wait, that's an important term. And starting here, we have things of like a critical way of thinking and the scientific method. These are two key terms. The scientific method is a specific thing. It's integrated into all forms of actual science. And it's something that once you know this term and you hear it, you have to understand, okay, that's important. There's a lot that's behind it. And then I can use those terms to research more. So even at this time and throughout the entire course, you can take what notes I provide in the scientific method. You can also go to other videos, and you can go to other readings and delve deeper into that and use the word scientific method as one of your keywords for searching for more information, and remind you that this is an important part of this actual culture. Now, with that beginning definition, there is a couple of assumptions that you get out of this. That one, that there is a set of laws that govern the universe. And so this is a presumption, even from science being the objective, there's things separate from us, and there are specific ways things that happen. So being these laws or rules, being representing that this is repetitive, this is the way Things happen, and if we can uncover those laws or rules, we can then start using those to our advantage, or just understanding the world better around us. And also that these laws can be understood at all. So this is a presumption within science that we're coming from the base that we can understand these and they are covered. Now, nothing from this is ever set in stone. There is usually the point that there's enough evidence that this is backed up to what we know now, but always opening up that things could change in the future once new evidence comes in play, once there's a counterplay between ideas and what is the dominant form of that actual knowledge. Now, another key thing from all of this is that science isn't always about what is truth or true or false. That dichotomy between there only being one exact answer and there's nothing else that can come from that, or it's false and there's only one way of knowing. And science is more of the idea of the least false. It's a weird thing to say. It's almost along the lines of like, well, this is the least false based upon all the evidence that we actually have for now. Boom. This is what we know. And that later on, this could actually change. So we're kind of coming as the ideas that are least false out of everything, out of every possible scenario from this, and what evidence we have and what's backed up by the actual evidence itself is showing, okay, this is what we have found. So science attempts to discover laws that have never been shown to be not true. Absolute truth in science is impossible to determine. So absolute being this is the only one. What you will have is something that is so strongly backed up by the actual evidence that there is nothing else that has been found to this point to counter that. Some people may try and show that it never holds up to the new ideas, or something could change in the future once we have new evidence and science evolves and changes and grows on its own. The body of actual knowledge that we have. So science really isn't about producing what is true and what is the truth. It's more about, okay, well, this is the knowledge or fact that we have, the evidence and reasoning behind that, and that it's always open to change if new evidence actually comes into play and it's been vetted by the actual community itself. So, example, if we look at what's called the law of gravity, or just even that concept of gravity, of you trip, you fall, you throw things, they don't just go on forever. They come down at some point in time, and part of that is understanding the concept of gravity and the laws behind that and how can you actually calculate that, and how even from that concept has changed over time. Now, at first you may be getting scared because on the screen there's, great, there's physics formulas and stuff from the past and math and things that you may have some positive relation to or some negative. Now, here, this is just an artifact. You don't need to memorize any of this. This is just an actual example. You can see one of mathematical equations. You can see descriptions and definitions. Now, this was the beginning form of the law of gravity, so Newton's law of gravity, that a particle attracts every other particle in the universe using a force that is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. So basically, bigger you are to the other shape, the more pull you will have towards something actually else. Now, this was understood and accepted for so long based upon the actual evidence, but later on, when it was challenged by Einstein and backed by the evidence, and then shown to other people, it changed. That based upon Einstein's view, we still have gravity, but it's more that the perspective of the force of gravity arises from the curvature of space and time itself. And you can look into this more and watch whole documentaries on this. I find it actually very interesting. But this is just one example of what's both talking about gravity, and we have Newton, which is a lot earlier in history, but then it being challenged by Einstein and showing that this is something that has grown and actually changed over time. And so now what we understand more is either like the idea of Newtonian gravity or Einstein's view on gravity. Now, I said before, I said the word knowledge instead of truth, and this is the bigger part for science. Scientists don't seek to find out what is true. They do not generate truth or even certainty. And certainty being this is exactly what it will always be and it will never change. This doesn't back up. It's based upon the evidence. This is what we know to now, and then later on, as new evidence come into play, things could actually change, but being vetted by it. So they don't generate this truth. I think they generate knowledge based on what we know and what we've actually found. They propose a test, And they test these theories that are based upon evidence, knowing full well that future evidence may result in these theories being refined or even rejected and ultimately replaced. So things can change. That one idea of certainty, what is this always will be, could always change. Everything will evolve, everything will change, and everything will grow. But then it has to be backed up and done in a specific way, following the scientific method, vetted by the actual community, and even then later on, even if it's been vetted, it can be removed and changed once new evidence comes into place. So this is a key part when you're talking about stuff. You're talking about that generation of knowledge within science, and you're seeking this new knowledge and to challenge, create new ideas and back them up, generate and test maybe older ideas and challenge them based upon newer evidence. Now, coming up here, I have a bunch of videos that we're actually going through that you don't need just to hear me talk. It's important to, if we're looking at science as a culture, is to listen to people who are part of that actual culture and what are they saying about it. How do they talk? How do they dress? How do they move? How do their bodies interact? What joys do they get from actual science, and showing who can be part of science and what actually affects it. So I've got a range of specific videos that I found that I think talk about stuff, give you a perspective, and then you can interpret them as you see fit. So this first one is from Dr. Anna Reyes. She's a lecturer in the Department of Physics and Information Systems and Computer Science in Manila in the Philippines.
Some people sometimes wonder if I've always wanted to be a scientist. So today I'd like to share with you a bit of my story. When I was a kid, I asked a lot of questions. Makulit akong bata. Thankfully, my mom, who's somewhere in the back there, never tired of them. She wouldn't shush me or dismiss me like other parents would. Even if she didn't know the answer, she would simply say, "Anak, hindi ko alam. I don't know. But we can find out together." And so we look it up in our books. Wala pang internet noon, can you imagine? But the important thing is, I learned that it was okay to ask questions. In fact, it was good to ask them and to look for the answers. And I never stopped asking since. One afternoon, it was raining, so I asked, "Saan galing ang ulan? Where did the rain come from?" So the answer she gave is from the clouds. Tama. But of course, I asked, where do clouds come from? So we looked it up, and I learned about the water cycle. Clouds themselves form from water that evaporated from the rivers and the ground itself after it rained. So water made its way from the ground up to the sky and back down again as rain. And the cycle would repeat itself again and again. So I learned that behind something that seemed unpredictable and random, like the rain, sometimes it rained, sometimes it didn't. Thankfully today, hindi umulan. There's actually an underlying process. There's an order that's hidden from plain sight, but it's there all the same. And it's happening all the time. And that gave me comfort then, as it does today. When I was a kid, I wanted to become an astronaut. I was fascinated with space, like many kids are. But I was smart too. Soon I realized that was not a practical dream. Height limit pa lang, hindi napapasa. So I set my sights back down on Earth. At some point, I wanted to become a lawyer, like our friends here, and actually like our good family friend, Attorney Lontok. And then I wanted to become an architect, like my older cousin, who was studying to be one then and is a successful one now. Eventually, I settled to wanting to go into business, just like my parents. It was only in high school at Philippine Science when I started to even think that I can become a scientist. You see, growing up, we didn't know anyone who was a scientist. So it didn't even occur to me that I can be one. In the books, scientists were an abstract concept, or they were people long dead in strange costumes, like that guy, not from here, not from now, and nothing like me. So it was only in high school when I started to read about scientists who I can relate to and who I admired, Uncle Albert and Mr. Feynman, that I started to think I can follow the same path. And that became my dream, and that's what I did. Luckily, it turned out to be a natural fit. You see, as a scientist, it is my job to ask questions and to look for the answers. Only this time, the questions are not those for which you can find the answers to in a book or even in the internet. These are questions for which no one knows the answers to, at least not yet. It's our job as scientists to push the boundaries of knowledge, to discover something new, and to understand the world a bit better than we did before. One of the greatest pleasures of doing science is that moment when, after months and months of hard work, you print out a chart that is the first time was done. So you're the first person to know that thing. And that's the pleasure of being a scientist. As an astrophysicist, we ask questions like, how did the galaxies form? How did the universe begin? How will it end? And these are big questions. But the reason we can even begin to answer these big questions is because there is an underlying order behind all physical phenomena. The rain, the earth, stars, the whole cosmos follow the same physical rules. And these are rules that we understand. The science that explains the clouds here on Earth is the same science that explains the giant clouds of Jupiter, and it's the same science that explains even the clouds in planets outside the solar system, like Kepler 7b, which we believe has clouds like Earth. The gravity that pins me to the stage and you to your seats is the same gravity that holds our galaxy together and that governs the evolution of the universe as a whole. And so this sense of order that I got when I was a kid is with me today. It's even stronger. It stretches over all space and time. But I don't confine myself to questions of astrophysics. For in fact, the world is much, much bigger than the universe. As a Filipino, I ask questions like, where did the Philippine archipelago form? And how did it come to be populated? Who are our ancestors? And these are big questions too. And our scientists at the Philippine Genome Center and National Science and Research Institute, led by Dr. Corazon de Ungria and Mr. Frederick Delfin, with current DNA analysis technology, they can already start piecing together some answers. When I was a kid, I asked, where did the rain come from? Today, our scientists at DOST's Project NOAA and at the Manila Observatory ask questions like, when will it rain? Where will it rain? And how much? They ask, where will the rain go? And perhaps more importantly, to save lives and livelihoods from floods, where should it go? Just recently, I don't know if you've heard, but just across Katipunan, they discovered a new species of water beetle, that one, right inside Ateneo campus. So a new species right inside Metro Manila. And in fact, our country has one of the highest concentrations of endemic biodiversity in the world. And we can only begin to imagine how rich and how unique life is in our forests, in our mountains, our waters, waiting to be discovered and studied. And if we are wise, to be protected and preserved. So I hope I've given you a flavor of the wonderful work being done by scientists right here in our country. And there are many, many more stories that deserve to be told. And I hope that they will be. They continue to be more and more. See, I have a confession to make. When I was younger, I thought naively, though perhaps understandably, that to be like the scientists who I read about and I admired, I had to go study and work where they studied and worked, abroad. And that's what I did. But today, I'm happy to say, after 8 years, long years abroad, I no longer think that's true. Today, I'm happy to say I've decided to come back and to do science here. Because even though there's still many challenges to doing science here, in many ways it's true that it's a wonderful time to be a scientist in the Philippines. And I'm excited by the fact that as more and more people realize this and join us, geographically and virtually, together, we can form a future where science plays a greater role in our country's public life, a future in which engaging questions is encouraged by our culture, not dismissed. A future in which more and more young Filipinos can grow up thinking they can be scientists too. And I feel very lucky that I can be part of building this future. You may ask me, Reina, why bother? Why bother to ask these questions? What does it matter to me today? And to be honest, I find myself asking these questions too, sometimes. But in the end, I have to ask back, why not? Why not ask? Why not ask like a child naturally asks questions? Like I did when I was a kid, like you did too when you were a kid. The question is, when did you stop asking? And why did you stop asking? My appeal to you today is to remember that makulit na bata you once were. My appeal is that you don't shush the little kid inside you who is asking questions. And please, don't shush the real kid beside you for being makulit. My hope is that you find yourself asking questions again, like a kid. And with your kid, or young cousin, neighbor, or niece. My hope is that you discover the pleasure of learning something new every day. And my hope is that you never stop asking. And I hope the same for myself. For we do not ask questions because they matter. We do it because it matters that we ask questions. Thank you very much.
And you can see a lot of very important things there. That she talks about like asking questions and having this openness. She opens the idea of where and when and who does science and who's considered part of that, and expanding that in culture. And then what does that mean to being able to answer questions, look deeper, build off of that, see the world in a different way, and understand the world around us. Now, Dr. Susan Greenfield, a British scientist, writer, and broadcaster, and her research focuses on the treatment of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, and what she says about science literacy and what is the importance of, like, what does it mean to understand that? You may not be engaged in being a scientist every day, but what does that mean when decisions are being made with or without the use of actual science, or how does that actually affect us?
I always quote Carl Sagan, the now sadly deceased astronomer, who said it's suicide to live in a society dependent on science and technology where virtually no one knows anything about science and technology. And it's true, if you don't know what a gene is, how can you possibly evaluate GM foods? You're just told things, you're the victim then of a sensationalist media possibly, or of hype, or you might be conned into thinking everything is fine. But you need to know yourself, and you can only know if you have the information at your fingertips. So in a way, the democratization of science is essential, whereas 10, 20, certainly 30 years ago, the scientists were at the margin of society. Now they're at the center of it because science and technology It's touching so much of everything we care about: reproduction, nutrition, the climate, communication, education. It's essential that the average person is scientifically literate. They don't have to be scientists any more than you have to be a professional sports person to enjoy sport, or with a degree in literature to be able to appreciate a novel. You don't need those things, but of course you're not the same as the specialist, but you can have a grasp of what's going on. And I think that's what we need to do with science. It's no longer an optional extra, it's an essential.
So those are key things that she is talking about, and that democratization of science, this openness up and access to all people to have access to it. And we are in North America. We are in a society that science has had a big impact on. You may not follow it, you may disagree with different ideas, but it has impacted the society where we are, what we use, the technologies that we have, what we have access to. And so you should understand that yourself. What does that mean when you could dig deeper from these questions to understand it? If this is a culture, what are the important things that you must see from the answers that are coming back if it's considered to be scientific? What do you have? Now, she mentioned Carl Sagan was an interesting individual. He was an American astronomer, cosmologist, not cosmologist, astrophysicist, astrobiologist, author, scientist, like basically very publicly and outgoing. And this next video is an older one. It does center more around American politics, but it does say, well, what are the important things? Like, again, it's an older video, but it's still something that rings true today.
My feeling, Charlie, is that it's not that pseudoscience and superstition and New Age so-called beliefs and fundamentalist zealotry are something new. They've been with us for as long as we've been human. But we live in an age based on science and technology with formidable technological powers.
Science and technology are propelling us forward at accelerating rates.
That's right. And if we don't understand it, by we, I mean the general public, if it's something that, oh, I'm not good at that, I don't know anything about it, then who is making all the decisions about science and technology that are going to determine what kind of future our children live in? Just some members of Congress, but there's no more than a handful of members of Congress with any background in science at all. And the Republican Congress has just abolished its own Office of Technology Assessment, the organization that gave them bipartisan, competent advice on science and technology. They say, we don't want to know. Don't tell us about science.
Surprising. It's the danger of all this. I mean, this is not the thing.
There's two kinds of dangers. One is what I just talked about, that we've arranged a society based on science and technology in which nobody understands anything about science and technology. And this combustible mixture of ignorance and power, sooner or later, is going to blow up in our faces. I mean, who is running the science and technology in a democracy if the people don't know anything about it? And the second reason that I'm worried about this is that science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along. It's a thing that Jefferson laid great stress on. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in the Constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Now, that's very important. What does it mean by being a society that we are North America? A society that has been centered around science and other aspects. And, like, I believe that everyone should at least understand it. You may not always accept everything, not that everything that's been produced, what could be coming out of culture science is the best, but things change and evolve. And you should have that understanding. And if other people are making decisions, do you understand why they're making the decisions? Do you know what rights are being lost when those are taken away? or what you could gain. What do you stand up for as an actual person? No matter what field you're in and what you're going into, this has had an impact. And also that you can have an impact and change, that if you see those problems, how can you go about opening that dialect? How can you go about changing stuff to change the actual world itself? And that you can become part of it, and it's not just separate, done by everyone else. And something that's important to me is always this idea of art and science, that I find so much in schools and silos, that art and science always seem to be something so separate, that people are going into the sciences or they go into the actual arts, and they're two separate things. I realize that this is just combined. These are just different ways of looking at stuff in this actual world. Now, both science and art are human attempts to understand and describe the world around us. The subjects and methods have different traditions, and the intended audiences are different, but I think that the motivations and goals are fundamentally the actual same. We're just trying to understand and look at the world in different ways. That sometimes through science we can understand that I have a question, and how is it answered? And there's something, maybe I have a question and I'm answering it through art or some kind of understanding, through some kind of sensorial experience that's transmitted to others that doesn't purely come from a dialectical conversation of talking back and forth with people. And it's not the separation of battling arts, battling sciences, and which one is better, which one is worse. They're just different ways that can be combined together, and seeing that and seeing what impact it actually has. There is science and art. Paint itself, that alchemy, the chemistry, what does it mean to understand it? Computers themselves, binary, the cameras, expression of anatomy and portraits and how they're actually drawn, and what does that mean, and how is it actually communicated? There is art in science itself, depending on how people see the artistic precision of a scalpel, the cool aesthetics of a laboratory, and the intimate observations undertaken by a scientist to discover new material and microbes living in the unseen world. Just as Dr. Raylan Reynolds talked about, is that when she saw that chart, that joy that she got from it, and that is a form of art to her, and that expression. And what does it mean to put everything actually together? Now, I cannot have a course where I do not introduce Bill Nye. If anyone's had, from my era, growing up, you see Bill Nye. And I love his takes on these two questions of, is art as important as science? And do I have to choose between science and arts education?
Hi Bill, my name's Theo. I'm 13 years old and I'm a huge fan of your work. I want to know if you think art is important. And if art is important, is it as important as the sciences? Thanks.
Theo, you got to have art. We have to have art. We have to have science. I will claim that science is the best idea humans have ever had. But I mean, I'm a science educator. I mean, you'd expect that from me. But I listen to music all day. I make up lyrics for songs all day. When I make a thing, which I like to do all the time, a tinkerer, I like the thing to look good. And I've done stand-up comedy, telling jokes in an effort to get people to think about us, ourselves, our relationships to each other, our society. These to me are all forms of art that I participate in. I shudder to think what my world would be like without other artists contributing. It would just not be nearly as good. You have to have both, but what I encourage everybody is you don't want to have one to the exclusion of the other. You want to have both, science and art. However, science has affected our society dramatically. What's the most significant invention ever? Might be a sewer. Without sewers, we would just not have as good a life as we have right now in the developed world. And that's based on science. Roads, cars, this computer, this video interaction that we're having, that's all enabled by science. But you want the background to look good? Wait. You want my tie to look good. Whoever made my tie was an artist. And I'm glad that he or she was out there doing this piece of art. So you got to have both, man. Don't take one or the other. And don't use it as an excuse not to learn algebra.
Hi, Bill Nye. This is Sam Passer. And my question for you is, as an art student myself, do I have to choose between art and science for our next generations to thrive? Or can art and science coexist? Please let me know. Thanks.
Sam, art and science have to coexist. They're both human endeavors. However, just keep in mind, I'm a science guy on like this, that science, this process that humans have developed, seems to be, to my way of thinking, the best idea we've had. About how to know nature, how to know our place in the world, in the cosmos. But without art, we would hardly be people. Art is created by people, and it inspires each of us. It's the way we send messages. It's the way we motivate each other or keep each other from doing something. Art is part of us. We don't want art or science. We want both. With that said, a little commentary about our current controversy in education in the United States. Everybody goes on and on with this acronym, STEM. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is a fine acronym. It talks about, or it was created to address what was a clear need here in the United States. After people landed on the moon, investment in basic research was curtailed, except in military spending. And so the United States stopped doing as much basic research as it had been doing. And so to reinvigorate this, people created this acronym, and there's all these science, technology, engineering, and math programs in school. It's good. That's good. Now people talk about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. Well, good. Yes. Then I've heard STEAMed, science, technology, engineering, art, math, and design. Okay. Pretty soon the acronym is going to have all the letters that we would call school. It's just school. You go to school and you've got to have math. You've got to have language arts, English in my case, in the United States where English is the primary language. You've got to have history. You got to have, I'd like us to have civics about the U.S. Constitution and the behavior and the way the government is created. And we got to have art. We got to have science. Yes, we got to have all that. But this tacking stuff on this acronym that became so popular, STEM, is okay. But everybody, let's not forget, we got to do everything. It's not one or the other. Please, it's not one or the other. Learn the process of science. You don't have to become a scientist full-time or an engineer full-time. And for those of you who love science and engineering, I hope you pursue some art and learn some art and how to create art yourself and appreciate it. That's what makes us people. Go for it.
Now, Earl's thing is valid, and this is a video I found online, but I think does a good job where they got a range of people together that consider themselves to be scientists and be artists, and their interactions between both, and the cultural artifacts of what do you actually expect.
Society has long championed the idea that science and art are opposites, existing on opposite planes. Science is driven by logic and rationality, while art is driven by emotion and creativity. But are science and art really that different? To investigate, we asked 2 scientists and 2 artists to tell us their honest answers to a series of questions about their fields. We didn't tell them what we intended to do with the footage, and their answers were surprising.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and I'm a science communicator.
My name is Anthony. I am a science communicator.
My name is Marvin, and I'm an artist.
My name's Simone, and I'm a musician. I also make visual art.
Factual, objective, reproducible, and accurate.
I would use the words fun, exciting,
challenging, beautiful.
I don't know if it can be summed up in words. Rigorous.
Slightly geeky, slightly out there, nonconformist, quirky.
I think of kooky old guys with curly hair and glasses walking around in lab coats.
Miserable, sensitive, dissatisfied, unsure.
To me, it's just this cartoon of this little white man with a mustache, and he has a beret.
Anyone can be an artist.
It could be a man, it could be a woman, anyone can be a scientist.
Everyone and anyone can be a scientist.
Any person could be an artist.
Things that make you cry in the best way possible.
They're constantly changing, shedding its skin, allowing for new forms and new identities to emerge.
I think nature is very beautiful. The colors and all the very intricate patterns and how these patterns and colors have evolved.
I didn't always know that flowers were beautiful. I think I was 29 when I first saw the beauty of a rose, but now I see it as like the most beautiful thing to stop and smell a rose.
People who just litter, people who just don't really care much about the environment.
Aspirational lifestyles, people fronting fakeness, people kind of like running away from themselves.
Vector graphics, this Mountain Dew ads, so gross. A lot of the filters on digital photography are so ugly.
I think that we need to be very careful with the choices that we make, especially who we choose as our leaders.
People are denying a very valuable connection to the land, really engaged in a deep theft from Indigenous peoples. I fear that things are going to get worse.
I like art. I'm not particularly artistic, but I like looking at art.
I feel like I am illiterate when it comes to science. I really wish I was a physicist.
For me, art has always been kind of confusing as a concept. I'm coming to understand that that's the nature of art, that pieces speak to you in different ways and some speak more than others.
Love science. I was really good in chemistry and biology in high school.
You said the guy who makes all the square patterns and stuff? There's that one with the big white square and the red and the yellow and the blue. Yeah, him. I like his art.
There was a lady who, and I like a lot of the work she does. She likes to do kind of dramatic pieces. She and somebody else leaned back between them, and if he let go, she would definitely die. In a very visceral way, kind of helped me to understand what trust is between two people.
Molecules, organisms, the way that they sort of like dissect and spread as like a metaphor for how bodies move through space.
The law of thermodynamics, that everything is moving from order to chaos. And in fact, I feel like I am explicitly a force of entropy.
Science is beautiful, exactly like art.
I know, we're in the same boat.
Art can be observational, science can be observational, art can be theoretical, and science can be theoretical.
Art is science and science is art. They're all ultimately creative and technical endeavors.
I think that the barrier is simply pragmatic, where like science is applied. It seeks concrete evidence and concrete ways of changing things, whereas art is more concerned about implementing ideas and shifting perspectives.
We're very much streamed from an early age into science and math or into the arts, and that's, I think, to the detriment of our culture in general.
Society is...
Now, we can't go through all of this without stepping into math. Because mathematics is the language of science, or as some would say, curse words, the language of science, but yeah, curse words fit into so many aspects of life. But mathematics is that language. It is a way of expressing and talking about things. And if you're going to do science, every form of science will have some form of mathematics within it. There's measurable, quantifiable, all reasoning. Math has to be there. So if you are going to, again, critique science or be part of that actual culture or whatever aspect you so choose, mathematics has to become part of that and that understanding that's behind it. As you can see here, mathematics is pure language, the language of science. It is unique among languages in its ability to provide precise expression for every thought or concept that can be formulated in its terms. Now that's key from there, is that precision, that communicating across of what you can do to precisely communicate information. and itself has its own esoteric symbols, but you have to learn that language. You have to understand what does that mean within that actual concepts and understand the limitations that some forms of math will have. Mathematics is a language plus reasoning. It's like language plus logic. Mathematics is a tool for reasoning. You have to have this form of reasoning of how do you get from point A of a question to point B, your answer, and how did you get there? And that logical sequential steps of doing that and coming to that point and term. And doing anything with quantitative reasoning, then backing that up of where does that evidence come from and how do you communicate and talk about that? So just like any language, it's important to be clear and concise. Otherwise, you may not be able to get your ideas communicated convincingly. Or you may not be able to, even just by writing down, reason out and plan and understand anything. So science uses math itself to do that communication, to be that kind of precision way of talking, way of reasoning. But mathematics is also a study on itself. It's a whole other field, whole other area, and every other science will use mathematics and different forms of math in different ways. So an analogy would be the English language. Just like you use English to study history, or this course, or speak or communicate or work with anybody else, and the cultural context of what does that mean around there, you can also study, for example, the structure of the English language itself. Now, science uses mathematics, so scientists need to understand an understanding of how mathematics works, have an understanding of how it can be applied. Without a fundamental understanding, we cannot properly use math to represent or analyze information. We will come to a flawed understanding of the physical world from this scientific perspective. And so you need to understand of where that is actually coming from and dig deep into that and make it part of that overall culture. Now, questions. We always have questions. Now, is math the language of the universe? Is it something that can describe everything? Now, I'm pulling from this video from the channel The Science Asylum, and where he's dealing with the question that there is a very common debate over the nature of math. Is it something that exists as part of the universe? So this is what everything is that we slowly discover, or is it something that we make up and try to explain our crazy world? Now, a key part of this video I want to watch is, again, this is someone who's part of the actual culture. So what things do you see on the shelves he chooses behind him? What clothing does he wear between he switches between different characters of that stereotypical scientific kind of like garb? How does he back up his argument? Because he has this question, is math the language of the universe? And he comes to an answer in the end and trying to explain in a reasoned, logical sequence steps. You will see him bringing up definitions. So he can give stating a fact or evidence, in this case of, well, if we say what language is, here's the definition. And if we need to then say, is math a language, we look for other facts and how can we combine these two together to make a sequence or a chain of thought that then someone else can also work their way through. So setting that evidence. And even in this video itself, you'll get a feel for what we'll talk about more as we get into the course of that scientific method.
Hey crazies, there's this thing that mathematicians and physicists like to say, math is the language of the universe. You've probably heard it so many times that you've just accepted it as truth. But rule number 8 here at the Science Asylum is question everything. Is math really the language of the universe? Answering this question is going to take some time, and we need to be careful. So let's start with a simpler question. Is math even a language? What is a language anyway? That's 2 questions, but I'll see what I can do. We need to know what a language is before we can decide if math is one. A language is a complex system of words and symbols, either spoken or written, used by a particular community as a means of communication. Okay, so it makes sense why something like English, German, Arabic, or Iglatenpay would be languages. But what about math? Is math a complex system of words and symbols? Yes. Either spoken or written? Mostly written, but yes. Is it used by a particular community? Definitely yes. As a means of communication? Well, maybe. The purpose of math isn't just to communicate ideas to each other. Math is used as a tool to make predictions about the actual world. Of course, that requires us to also ask, is the sole purpose of a language to communicate? I would say no, and I think most of you would agree with me. Language can also be used as a tool. In the right hands, language can be used to inspire, or to lighten the mood, or to strengthen someone's resolve. In the wrong hands, it can be used to hurt someone, to destroy their reputation, instill fear, or even control others. So I don't think the fact that math is used as a tool is a disqualifier. The definition of a language doesn't even require that communication be the sole purpose. It said as a means of, not for the purpose of. I'm still not entirely convinced though. We need another test. Something else we know about languages is that you can translate between them. So if we can translate between math and something like English, then we might have a decent argument. Oh, you want to start an argument? Well, let me tell you that kind of argument. When I say argument, I don't mean one of those fights over politics or whatever. An argument is more of a set of reasons or ideas in support of a conclusion in an effort to persuade others to the same conclusion. It's a point made by a logical individual in a calm discussion. People rarely think logically in political conversations. Anyway, let's give translation a try. When you translate from any language to another, some meanings can get lost. But as long as most of the ideas translate, I think we're good. We said earlier that languages are made of words and symbols, and that math has plenty of symbols. The most recognizable symbol is probably this one, the equal sign. But the word equal is more of a name than a meaning. A good direct translation of the equal sign would be is the same as, which is a phrase rather than a word. But that's okay. Translations don't have to be a one-word to one-word correspondence. This English 8-word sentence is 6 words in Polish, but 10 words in Albanian. Math is just much more concise. It takes fewer symbols to contain a meaning, except you don't find a mathematics option in Google Translate. So what gives? Is it a language or not? I don't think we can judge by Google Translate. It only has 103 languages, and there are over 6,900 spoken languages currently in use, not to mention all the dead languages. My point is that Google Translate is far from complete. So let's try a translation on our own. Math uses the Latin letters and the Greek letters, both uppercase and lowercase, and a whole collection of other unique symbols, which is probably why people are so afraid of it. All of those symbols have at least one meaning, but many have multiple meanings that we have to understand by context. For example, an uppercase B could be the bulk elastic constant, which represents how rigid something is in response to pressure changes, like air in response to a sound wave passing through it. But an uppercase B could also be the strength of a magnetic field, the kind of thing you might imagine is around a bar magnet. This is pretty typical of languages, though. Take the English word duck, for example. It could refer to a type of bird, or the action of suddenly lowering your head. Words with multiple meanings are so common, there's a word to describe them. Homonym. So multiple meanings doesn't disqualify math as a language either. Let's try to translate a whole sentence. Say you've got a simple mathematical sentence like this. It makes use of 6 symbols. Delta, S, equals, F, I, and minus. We've already seen equals means is the same as. Delta means change in, and S means position, or where something is. The F and I are only subscripts. They just describe the symbol they're attached to, so they're more like adjectives than nouns. F stands for final, or at the end. I stands for initial, or at the beginning. And minus means the difference between. So this mathematical sentence reads, the change in where something is the same as the difference between where that something is at the end and where that something is at the beginning. Seems like a pretty logical statement to me. You can do this with other mathematical sentences too. Newton's second law, Ohm's law, even Einstein's equation. Like any other translation though, you lose some meaning. Mathematical sentences say a lot more than their English translation. You're also going to have a really hard time translating the other way. This English sentence has no translation in math. Although I'm willing to hear arguments in favor of this one. Translations, grammar, adjectives, and nouns sounds a lot like a language to me. And as a scientist, I use it to communicate with people all the time. So is math a language? I would argue yes. And just like any other language, it's governed by a set of rules. Those rules are just a lot more absolute than a typical language, and they're built from the ground up. This gives math some extra power if you know how to use it. Which brings us back to our original question. Is math really the language of the universe? Okay, this one's a little trickier. If math really is the language of the universe, then anything we calculate should have meaning, which seems to be true of counting. We take something like this and call it 1, and something like this and call it 2. We can put them together and call that 3. We can put 3 of those 3s together and call it 9. These seem like pretty solid rules, and they seem like they apply to the universe, but we're going to learn a lot more if we try to disprove it. We need to find a number that doesn't have any meaning. There are tons of calculations I could just make up, but no one would ever expect those to have any meaning. Maybe something people would expect to have meaning? What about density? Oh, that's brilliant! I'm so glad you're a clone of me. Density measures the compactness of a substance. An easy way to calculate it is to take the mass and divide it by the volume. And this tells you something about the spacing between the molecules. It makes sense for things like ice, or rubber, or helium gas, or air. Wait a minute. Density measures the compactness of a substance. Air is a mixture of a bunch of different things. Mostly nitrogen and oxygen, but still, a mixture. It's a pretty uniform mixture though, so I can understand arguments in favor of calling it one substance. But what about this? Can't I just measure mass on a scale and volume using a beaker, and then divide the two numbers? I suppose you could, but that number wouldn't really say anything. It's what we call an average density, which might make sense for a uniform mixture like air, but not for this rubber ducky. It's made of two substances, rubber and air, and they're definitely not uniform throughout the ducky. So while it might be a useful shortcut in a calculation somewhere, it doesn't actually tell you anything about the compactness of that ducky. It's a number that only exists on paper. It has no physical meaning, and that's another reason it can't be used to explain why things float. Commenters? Anyway, all average values sit in this gray area. Sometimes they have meaning, and sometimes they don't. Meaning is what we're looking for in science. We're trying to understand deep philosophical questions about our existence, like, where did we come from? Why are we here? Science is about meaning. It's about language. Plus, there are plenty of statements that have meaning, but don't have a translation into math. Math alone will never be enough. No number will ever answer those deep philosophical questions. Not even 42. Math is not the language of the universe. Even if we wanted to personify the universe and say it's trying to communicate with a language, which I would advise against, math would only be a small part of our best translation of it. So what do you think? Does the universe work using math, or is it something we made up? I'd like to know in the comments. Thanks for liking and sharing this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with us. And until next time, remember, it's okay to be a little crazy. In the last video, we looked...
Now turning to the other part of this course name of innovation. What is innovation? We probably have all a different view of that and how it can come about. But innovation can be defined as simply as a new idea, device, or method, maybe an older idea, but a new way of thinking about it. However, innovation is often also viewed as the application of a different solution that meets new requirements. So, what brings along innovation? How can we go about innovating? Is it a brand new idea that only one person comes up with? Is it a constant evolution of combining older ideas and new things and testing it out? And now, for this course, I want to suggest the idea of scientific innovation. Of how does the scientific method play a role? And so we have a question, being, is this a new way of doing stuff? And how do we then test to see what effect this would actually have? And going through the actual method and based on evidence stuff we get back, how do we then innovate and get new ideas off of it? How do we take other research that has been done and build upon that? How do we, even while we're doing this process, be open and see new things that come out of it? And our topic, as I said earlier, is virtual reality and augmented reality. So again, nothing that you need to be experts on. You're not building this. It's just something that, you're seeing it more and more in different ways that it's ingrained into our society or being combined. Who knows what the future will bring? I've seen it for long enough myself that I can say it has some staying power and how it'll be changed. And I love seeing nowadays, once it's gone beyond purely scientific to business application to open public, how is it being incorporated and used and people's views on that, and a wide range of different fields that it could be used. And so when we get near the end of the course, we'll talk about virtual reality, augmented reality, and give you a feel from it, but come out of it of how could we think of new types of questions, new innovations, but coming from a scientific kind of cultural perspective as a way to innovate out of this. And there's other ways you can always go about innovating, but this is where we'll start within this course. Now, bigger questions for this course and goals by the end are two things. One, science literacy. Is given an article or a case or news or something you can watch, how can you analyze and understand, like, what are the good and bad aspects of it? If they're claiming that this is science, are they actually doing science? Can you question it? What authority is from it? And so you'll see already as one of the documents for this week is that, or like wherever we are, is case study, a student project. Now, this is one I've written that, as if I was taking on the role of someone very junior in science that is doing some kind of study and wrote it up, and we're going to use this as a case study to analyze as we go through stuff in the course as a cultural artifact. And as we learn new pieces of knowledge, how can we dissect this writing and say where it can be improved, what's good and bad, what are they actually following? And this would be a good task for you to constantly do in the entire course, because part of your final and part of the midterm will be involved analyzing these smaller case studies. If you're given something for the news about science, if you're giving it from a scientific article, if you're given something like this case study with a student, how could you interpret and show that you are understanding material from the course by how you talk about this? How do you show your individual learning of not just memorizing facts and regurgitating them onto an actual test, or as I like to call it sometimes, verbal vomiting everything you know in your head onto a paper without actually understanding it? How are you combining stuff from the course into your understanding of the actual material? Now, the other question to talk about this innovation is based on the material, like what we've learned in the course in augmented reality and virtual reality. How can you come up with an innovation based upon a scientific viewpoint of how to innovate with this? And I don't expect anyone to be majorly crazy in understanding this. It's just a point to play with the idea of what we know and the level of knowledge we have now, and being open, what questions could I have? And how can I turn those questions that science is good at answering? And how can I view and delve maybe a little bit deeper in showing your understanding of how would I innovate and then test those ideas using somewhat of a scientific method as a beginning point to maybe innovate or refine or change your designs. Now, I hope everyone has enjoyed the first lecture of many more. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at all times. And I do suggest maybe going back to this video, keeping notes on everything, and key things, maybe questions that came up to you, stuff that inspirational or not so good, whatever stuck out to you the most, and keep those notes as we talk more in this course. And you can bring these things back up when we come to the actual final.